You have not been coming to church recently, brother. Have a lot of work to do in my office. The church won't foot my bills.
Daniel Carter grew up in a small, struggling town where most families lived from one day to the next. The houses were simple, the roads were dusty, and opportunities were rare. Yet inside a modest wooden house at the edge of town lived a family whose greatest possession was not money but faith. Daniel lived there with his mother, Mary Carter, and his younger brother, Luke Carter. Their father had died when Daniel was only 10 years old, leaving Mary to raise the boys alone. Life became harder after his passing. Money was scarce, and many nights the family had to stretch what little food they had just to make it through the week. Still, Mary Carter never allowed poverty to steal the peace inside their home. She believed deeply that God watched over them, even in the hardest seasons. Every evening, after the small chores of the day were done, Mary would call her sons into the living room. The room was small and dimly lit, but to Daniel it always felt warm. "Come, boys," she would say gently, holding her worn Bible in her hands. "It's time to thank God for today." Daniel and Luke would sit beside her on the old sofa while she opened the Bible carefully. The pages were thin and slightly faded from years of use, but the words inside it were alive in Mary's heart. She would read passages about faith, hope, and trusting God during difficult times. Then they would pray together. Mary's prayers were simple but sincere. "Lord," she would say softly, "we may not have much, but we thank you for the breath in our lungs and the strength to keep going." Daniel listened to those prayers every night. Over time, they shaped the way he saw the world. Even when their kitchen shelves were nearly empty, Daniel believed that God had a plan for his life. On Sundays, the family attended their small neighborhood church led by Pastor Jonathan Reed. The church building was modest, with wooden benches and a simple pulpit, but it was filled with people who loved God sincerely. Daniel loved being there. While other young people sometimes complained about waking up early for church, Daniel arrived eagerly each week, ready to serve wherever he was needed. Before the service began, he helped arrange the chairs neatly in rows. If the choir needed assistance, he carried their instruments. Sometimes he even swept the church floor before anyone else arrived. Pastor Jonathan noticed Daniel's dedication. One afternoon after service, the pastor called him over. "Daniel," he said with a warm smile, "you have a servant's heart. God sees that." Daniel lowered his head respectfully. "I just want to help, sir." Pastor Jonathan placed a hand on his shoulder. "God will bless your life one day, but remember something very important." Daniel looked up attentively. "Never forget God when success finally comes." Those words stayed in Daniel's mind long after that day. Despite his faith, life remained difficult. There were nights when Mary served only a small meal, dividing it carefully between her sons. "Eat," she would insist, pretending she was not hungry. Daniel often noticed she skipped meals so they could have more. It hurt him deeply, but it also strengthened his determination. One night, as the family finished their prayers, Daniel spoke quietly. "Mum, one day things will change, I promise." Mary looked at him with gentle eyes. "Change will come, Daniel, but never let success change your heart." Luke nodded beside him, though he was still young enough not to fully understand. Daniel held on to those words. He began to dream of leaving the small town someday to find better opportunities. He wanted to help his mother, support his brother's education, and build a life that would remove the burdens from their shoulders. But more than anything, Daniel believed that God would guide his path. Years later, when he finally prepared to leave the town in search of a better future, Pastor Jonathan called him aside once more. "Daniel," the pastor said, looking at him seriously, "the world can change a person. Wealth, power, comfort, these things test the heart." Daniel nodded. "I understand, Pastor." "Do you truly?" Pastor Jonathan asked gently. Daniel answered with confidence, "I will never forget God." He believed those words with all his heart. Standing beside his mother and brother, Daniel promised both of them the same thing, that no matter where life took him, he would always remain faithful. At that moment, none of them knew how greatly that promise would one day be tested. Leaving home was one of the hardest decisions Daniel Carter had ever made. The small town where he had grown up was filled with memories, his childhood, the church that shaped his faith, and the simple home where his mother had raised him and his brother with love and prayer. But Daniel knew he could not remain there forever. So, with a small suitcase and the little money he had saved, Daniel boarded a bus to the city. The city was everything his hometown was not: loud, crowded, and fast-moving. Tall buildings stretched into the sky, and people hurried along the sidewalks as if every second mattered. At first, Daniel felt hopeful, but hope soon met reality. Weeks passed without steady work. Daniel went from one office building to another, filling out applications and attending interviews that led nowhere. "We'll call you," employers often said politely. But the calls never came. Soon his small savings began to disappear. He rented a tiny room in a rundown building and survived on simple meals, sometimes skipping food to stretch his money. Yet through all the uncertainty, Daniel did not abandon the habits his mother had taught him. Every morning before leaving his room, he knelt beside his bed and prayed. "God," he whispered one morning, "I know you brought me here for a reason. Please guide me." At night, he read his Bible, drawing strength from the verses that reminded him to trust God, even when the path seemed unclear. Months passed this way. Then one evening, while walking home after another unsuccessful job search, dark clouds gathered overhead. Within minutes, rain began pouring heavily onto the city streets. People rushed for shelter, but Daniel continued walking, pulling his jacket tightly around him. As he turned a corner, he noticed a sleek black car parked along the roadside with its hood open. A middle-aged man stood beside it, clearly frustrated as rain soaked through his expensive suit. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then approached. "Excuse me, sir," he said politely. "Do you need help?" The man looked at him with surprise. Daniel set down his bag and examined the engine as best as he could. Though he was not a mechanic, he managed to notice a loose connection that might have been causing the problem. After a few minutes of adjusting it, he stepped back. "Try starting it now," Daniel suggested. The man turned the key. The engine roared to life. The stranger looked genuinely impressed. "Well," he said, smiling slightly, "that was unexpected." Daniel simply nodded. "I'm glad it worked." The man studied him carefully. "What's your name?" "Daniel Carter." "And what do you do, Daniel Carter?" Daniel hesitated. "I'm looking for work." The man's expression changed. "My name is Richard Bennett," he said. "I own Bennett Industries." Daniel's eyes widened slightly. He had heard of the company. It was one of the city's largest businesses. Richard Bennett reached into his pocket and handed Daniel a business card. "Come to my office tomorrow morning," he said. "I believe someone with your honesty and willingness to help a stranger deserves an opportunity." Daniel stared at the card in disbelief. "Thank you, sir." The next morning, Daniel arrived at Bennett Industries earlier than anyone else. True to his word, Richard Bennett offered him an entry-level position at the company. Daniel accepted immediately. From that day forward, Daniel worked harder than he ever had before. He arrived early and stayed late, completing every task with care and discipline. Unlike some employees who complained about small responsibilities, Daniel approached each assignment with gratitude. His attitude did not go unnoticed. One of his co-workers, Emily Watson, admired his work ethic. "You work like this job is the greatest gift in the world," she said one afternoon. Daniel smiled. "In many ways, it is." Months passed, and Daniel's dedication began to pay off. Supervisors recommended him for promotions. His responsibilities increased, and so did his income. For the first time in his life, Daniel experienced financial stability. He moved into a better apartment, sent money home to his mother, and helped Luke with school expenses. But despite the new opportunities, Daniel still remembered where his blessings came from. One Sunday morning, he returned to church. Standing before the congregation during testimony time, Daniel spoke with gratitude. "Not long ago, I had nothing," he said, "but God opened a door when I least expected it." The church members listened with joy as he shared how his life had begun to change. "I know that everything I have today is because of God's grace," Daniel continued. As the congregation applauded softly, Daniel felt certain of one thing. No matter how successful he became, he would never forget the faith that carried him through the hardest days of his life. Within a few years at Bennett Industries, his dedication and sharp thinking had pushed him far beyond the entry-level position he first accepted. He began buying designer suits, expensive watches, and a sleek new car that turned heads wherever he drove. The young man who once counted every coin now carried himself with quiet confidence. At first, Daniel still remembered the lessons his mother had taught him. His responsibilities at work increased, and his schedule grew busier. Meetings filled his calendar. Business dinners often stretched late into the night. One evening after work, Daniel's colleague invited him to a gathering at an upscale restaurant. "There will be important people there," the colleague said. "Investors, entrepreneurs, people who can help your career." Daniel hesitated, thinking about the church service he usually attended that night. But then he reasoned with himself. Just this once, he thought. That evening was the first time Daniel met Andrew Mitchell. Andrew was wealthy, confident, and well-connected. He had built a reputation in the city as someone who knew the right people and attended the right events. He noticed Daniel almost immediately. "You're Daniel Carter, right?" Andrew asked, while holding a glass of sparkling drink. "Richard Bennett speaks highly of you." Daniel nodded politely. "I try to do my job well." Andrew laughed lightly. "You do more than that. People say you're one of the fastest rising employees in the company." From that night onward, Andrew took an interest in Daniel's career. He introduced him to influential people, invited him to exclusive events, and opened doors that Daniel had never even imagined. Soon Daniel's evenings became filled with social gatherings, business dinners, and high-profile parties. Daniel felt important. It was also during one of these events that he met Sophia Clark. Sophia was graceful, intelligent, and strikingly beautiful. She carried herself with elegance and confidence, and people often turned to look when she entered a room. Andrew introduced them with a smile. "Daniel, this is Sophia Clark. Sophia, Meet one of the city's rising business minds. Sophia studied Daniel with curiosity. So you're the one everyone has been talking about, she said. Daniel felt slightly embarrassed but smiled politely. Over the following weeks, Daniel and Sophia began spending more time together. They attended events, shared dinners, and explored the city's finest restaurants. Sophia admired Daniel's ambition and determination, but there was one part of his life she did not understand. One evening, while they sat together in his apartment, she noticed a Bible on the small table near the window. "You read this often?" she asked casually. Daniel nodded. "My mother taught me to stay close to God." Sophia tilted her head thoughtfully. "That's sweet," she said. "But Daniel, successful people usually grow beyond that kind of thinking." He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Sophia leaned back comfortably. "Religion is something people rely on when they have nothing else. But you're successful now. You built this life with your intelligence and hard work." Daniel did not respond immediately. At first, he disagreed with her words, but over time, as his life grew busier and more prosperous, those thoughts quietly settled in his mind.
Watch out for part 2.